مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. من حوالي 150 عاما أتت إنكلترا بمصطلح جديد يعبر عن الوقت الذي يكون فيه البرلمان متوقف عن الاجتماع، لأن جلساته انعقدت جميعها. وكان على الصحف أن تجد قصصا مجنونة لملء صفحاتها عن هذا الموضوع. في أميركا أصبح هذا المصطلح يستخدم لوصف الفترة التي تسبق الانتخابات، الفترة التي يقول فيها السياسيون أشياء مجنونة، وهو ما يصف سياساتنا على مدى 12 شهرا في كل سنة. المصطلح هو موسم سخيف، ولكن بين الحين والآخر يحدث شيء ما لتذكير قادتنا وسياسينا بأن العالم هو مكان خطر. ولقد شاهدنا مؤخرا واحدا من تلك الأحداث، وهو شبه الانقلاب في روسيا، البلد الذي يمتلك آلاف الأسلحة النووية. في الوقت الذي تهيمن فيه على الأخبار المشكلات الشخصية للرئيسين الحالي والسابق، من المشكلات القانونية لهنتر نجل الرئيس بايدن إلا مشكلات دونالد ترامب القانونية، كيف ستؤثر جرأة من الواقع الاستراتيجي في السياسة الأمريكية؟ لمناقشة هذه القضايا يسعدني أن أرحب بهيئة من الخبراء السياسيين البارزين سارة فارس ونيومي لين وميني راكر. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. We just witnessed a huge event, a near coup, a mutiny in Russia. Amid all the politics going on, especially the legal troubles facing leaders in America, from Donald Trump to Hunter Biden, the president's son, this was a sobering moment. How did American politicians react? Let's first start with the president and the White House. Sarah Ferris, Naomi Lynn, Minnie Racker, thank you for joining us today. Sarah, how did the White House deal with the events in Moscow?
Well, they were very quiet for days afterward. It really took some time before President Joe Biden finally did speak, and that's because he really wanted to get rid of any possible connection between the United States and what happened. There were some rumblings that were being spread that the United States was somehow involved. The White House was very, very careful to avoid this, and so Biden only spoke at the White House, talking to reporters long after this was over, after several days of the developments.
So we learned after the fact, Naomi, that U.S. intelligence actually knew that something was cooking inside Ukraine and Russia, that there was a developing mutiny coup. We're not sure exactly what to call it. Do people think that we had our hand in what was going on?
I mean, that is something that Russia is trying to push. We heard Sergei Lavrov actually make that argument. But what's really interesting is that developments have also occurred that Russian intelligence also had an inkling that something was going to happen. So both sides are sort of playing this intelligence up. But I think what's going to be interesting is how they are portrayed going forward, whether Vladimir Putin looks weaker in context because he did sort of threaten to punish Yevgeny Prigozhin, and we're sort of seeing with this deal that's emerged that at least for the moment he seems to be in safe harbor in Belarus.
All right, so let's go back to the American politics of this. Many among key Republicans, how did they view what was going on? There's an odd strain of sympathy for Putin among some parts of the Republican Party. Did we see this on display?
Yeah, I think you look at the front runners for the Republican nomination, particularly Trump. His main comment was, again, kind of very keeping in the Trump style of saying, you know, this, if I was president, we wouldn't see this tension between Russia and Ukraine. And, he made a comment like, be cautious of what happens next, because the next leader might be worse than Putin, kind of implying that. Again, very kind of Trumpian things where he doesn't really seem to be considering all of the strategic implications of what he's saying, versus some of the other candidates who are not front runners are kind of using it as an opportunity to slam Biden as well, but they're really emphasizing the way that the US should support Ukraine in their view and take this as an opportunity.
So let's focus on that for a minute. How did the events in Moscow and the near coup affect the debate on Ukraine policy? Well, it's first among the various Republican candidates. Naomi, what do you think?
Well, we've seen, for example, NATO is having a really important summit where they're admitting Finland for the first time. Obviously, Sweden's path to accession is being blocked by Turkey. And so actually they're leading the Republicans and Democrats, at least a couple of them, are leading a bipartisan coalition or a congressional delegation, I should say, to Lithuania in a couple of weeks. In terms of sort of the America First doctrine that we saw introduced by President Trump or former President Trump, that's something that people like Governor Ron DeSantis are echoing on the campaign trail. And then obviously we've just had a big fiscal argument with the debt ceiling. The White House announced this just recently that they are going to supply another sort of 50 million or 500 million, dollars to Ukraine in terms of a security package. But the money that was allocated last year is slowly running out. And so they're going to have to maybe ask lawmakers if they can sort of open their purse strings again, which is something that with Republicans controlling the House is something that will be more difficult than it was last year when there was unified Democratic control. And
when Sarah, when you look at the Republican leadership, both the nearly dozen candidates and the leaders in the House and the Senate, who is the strongest voice pro-Ukraine, all in, rejecting the hesitations that some in the party have on the pro-Ukraine policy?
I think the strongest support that we have seen has largely come from the U.S. Senate. So Republicans in the Senate, many of them have been there for many decades. They've seen what happens if the U.S. were, in their mind, if the U.S. were not to intervene there, they could see the threats that it would pose to the U.S., to surrounding regions. They've talked a lot about the instability that could happen. So I'm thinking of people like Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has been very strong on this. And there's just a lot more folks who align with that view in the Senate. Again, it's a body that has members who've been serving for a lot longer. In the House of Representatives, that this is where the divide is really happening. You can really see a glimpse of this battle that's been happening inside the Republican Party. If you look at the House of Representatives, you have Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who has been really pulled between the more right-wing faction of his party, and many of these align with Donald Trump. They align with former Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. These are the folks who don't want to see any money. These are the America First coalition that we've been talking about. But then you also have members who have been there for decades as well. They've served in the military. They talk about the instability that they have seen in their own military missions. They don't want to see this happening. So there's a really, really big push. And I believe we're going to see this happening, playing out in Congress this fall. I think we're going to see this spending fight. There's obviously a push to get more of this money to Ukraine now during their counteroffensive. I think we're going to start to see this when members come back in a couple of weeks.
All right, let's switch gears. Let's turn to some of the legal problems that I mentioned at the top of the show. Let's first start with the president's son, Hunter Biden. Minnie, what is the story here? Who is Hunter Biden? Why does anybody care about his tax difficulties? And what's the politics involved?
So I think Republicans have been using Hunter Biden as a way to kind of go after his father, the president. He has a history of drug addiction and some personal mistakes in his life. And he has recently, there's recently been arranged a plea deal where he is not going to go to jail, but accepts responsibility for tax evasion, basically, and a gun charge. And what Republicans are saying about that deal is that it's a sweetheart deal, that he's getting special treatment because he is the son of the president. Meanwhile, others are saying, like, maybe this wouldn't have even gotten the attention it did, but he's worse off because he is the son of a president. At the same time, House Republicans are going after him for business dealings abroad and trying to pin his business dealings, particularly in China, as something that they can go after President Biden with, trying to make the case that President Biden and his son's closeness to the leader of the free world had some influence on that business dealing. So basically what's going on, there's strong evidence Biden was in, but Republicans are kind of using everything they can to try to paint the image that this is going on as we gear up for this election year.
And Naomi, is this a so-called sweetheart deal, or is this a legitimate prosecutorial decision in how to handle the Hunter Biden case?
Well, if you look back in terms of how other deals have unfolded in terms of federal charges, I think the tax one in particular is something that we've seen happen in the past. The gun charge is like a little bit different just because he is getting a 2-year probation in terms of whether he can stay sober, whether he can remain clean. And so I think that one is sort of a little bit more open to interpretation. I think we see that happening more at the state level. So it is a little bit different. What I think has been really interesting as a White House reporter is seeing how the president has continued to embrace his son publicly. I mean, he's always been a prominent figure at the White House, spending weekends there, spending weekends with the president in Delaware at Camp David. But he was at the state dinner with that was supposed to honor Indian Prime Minister Modi. And so I think that that's a carry-on effect in terms of the strategy of the White House sort of publicly embracing these issues as a way to kind of counter the attacks, the political attacks that Minnie just described.
And so, Saris, do you think ultimately, what's the politics here? Will the Hunter Biden story reflect poorly on Joe Biden, who's always been squeaky clean on legal issues, or will it reflect well on him as a loving and committed father?
Well, I think we're going to have about 1.5 years of House Republican investigations before we fully know the answer to that. There's a lot of Republicans in Congress that are really gearing up to spend the entire time before the next election focusing on this. The entire this group of hard right Republicans wants to make this front and center. They're going to be looking at not just what the Department of Justice was doing when it made this deal with Hunter Biden, but behind the scenes, exactly what it was doing, getting into who was talking to who, and they're going to they're already alleging that there was collaboration, coordination, trying to get as we were talking about before, what they say is a sweetheart deal. And so we've seen this kind of thing before. We saw when Hillary Clinton was running for president, how Republicans in the House were able to really derail that by talking about Benghazi, by bringing up these accusations, by just digging up a lot of what they thought was dirt. Some of it was meaningful, some of it was not. But it can really just cloud the waters when there is a general public with not a ton of knowledge about a lot of these issues. Some of them are very complicated, lots of legal issues here, but are they able to raise enough questions that the average voter thinks, hey, what's the deal with this? Maybe there's something here. That's really their intent here. And I think we have a little bit of time before we know the answer to that.
All right, very good. Well, when we come back after the break, we're going to look at the legal troubles on the other side of the political aisle, Donald Trump, and the exploding number of Republican candidates who want to take on the former president in just a moment. Again, our guests today include Minnie Racker. Minnie is a campaigns staff writer at Time magazine. Previously, she was a staff writer at National Journal, and she reported for the Los Angeles Times. Her work covers the intersection of politics, identity, and culture. Also joining us is Sarah Ferris. Sarah covers Congress for Politico, a multimedia platform that's all politics all the time. A native of Newtown, Connecticut, she's also reported for The Hill and The Washington Post. And joining us today is Naomi Lim. Naomi is White House reporter at The Washington Examiner. She previously reported on crime and politics for News Corp in her native Australia. All right, let's move across to the status of Donald Trump's legal troubles. It now looks as though the classified documents federal trial, the most serious current legal difficulty he faces, won't start until at or near the end of 2023, ensuring that it will compete for headlines throughout the Republican primary season. How is that likely to play out? Sarah?
Well, it depends on whether Donald Trump is able to capitalize on what on being in the headlines. This is what he loves. He loves this earned media. He loves being the headline on every single cable news. He might not be on Twitter anymore, but that doesn't mean he's not going to dominate the conversation, whether it's other candidates being asked about him, whether it's voters being asked about him. I mean, particularly if this trial, there's even some reports that the trial could be dragged into 2024, the year of the election. If that happens, I mean, there's no chance that his opponents will be able to avoid being asked about him. And we've already seen that he's able to survive some of the most damning scandals in politics. There's Republicans that I'm talking to in the Capitol every day who still think he will end up winning the nomination, who think he could end up winning the presidency again, because he's just so resilient. His voters, they might see what they might see the news, they make their own opinions about that, and they've been able to stay with him. Obviously, there is a fracturing in the Republican Party. That's why there's a dozen candidates running now, a huge number of people in the field. But the loyalty so far has among the Republican base has really stuck with Donald Trump, despite these indictments. Now a second indictment, this one federal.
So, I mean, there's an odd split screen here where so many Republicans support Donald Trump, continue to support him, but yet the number of Republicans who sense weakness and are throwing their hat into the political ring is just exploding. As you said, a dozen or so. Many, when you look at the most recent crop of Republican candidates, any surprises?
Oh, I mean, I think, like you said, most people who are getting in the race right now, they know they're going to poll at 1%. They know that Trump is well lined up to win the nomination, and if not, we've got front runner or second front runner Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, kind of waiting to capitalize on that. But I think you see a lot of people like, say, Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, who are kind of getting in this race just to build their name recognition and maybe position themselves for a vice presidential slot. So no, I would say it's not a surprise to me. If I was a Republican right now, I would see this as a great opportunity, even if I don't necessarily think I'm going to win the nomination, to build that profile, to really get my name out there. And I think, even if they're not succeeding in the polls, they are getting their name out there, getting on TV pretty successfully.
Any particular candidate, Naomi, among the second tier that have recently announced that we should be watching closely?
I think someone like Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, he's got a flurry of recent good headlines in terms of actually building momentum in an early state such as Iowa. He is one of the top candidates out there in terms of spending on TV ads. And so I think we're seeing that. I was looking at some of the polling averages since Trump's second indictment, and he, as long as former Vice President Mike Pence are some of the ones that have sort of increased their support, albeit by only a couple of percentage points. But that's something when there, as you said, are these dozen candidates sort of squabbling over vote share. I think the other interesting thing about him is he's having this message of optimism. He also has this interesting dynamic in terms of race. And
all right, with that, Sarah, Minnie, Naomi, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on the state of politics in America today. When they have an insurrection in Russia, they really have an insurrection. I tried to follow the blow-by-blow of the coup attempt in Russia via Twitter. It was like a high-octane movie thriller. At one point, it seemed that an unstoppable column of tanks was headed straight for the Kremlin, with Russia's once formidable military evaporating before our very eyes. And then, within moments of wild reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin had fled the country, everything changed, with the man Putin just charged with treason, Yevgeny Prigozhin, doing a deal with the Putin toady who serves as president of Belarus to have his attacking forces turn around, and he himself would relocate to a dacha in Minsk. Is this the ultimate never mind, just kidding? I don't believe it, and I don't think the final chapter of this story has been written, not in terms of the ambitions of Prigozhin, the hard-charging leader of the private Russian militia called the Wagner Group that has terrorized people on 3 continents, not in terms of the wasting away of the once all-powerful wizard in the Kremlin, Putin, who now appears to be a small little man with shrinking power, and not in terms of the remarkable David beats Goliath story of the courageous Ukrainian fight against Russian aggression. I would like to think this all ends well, with the Ukrainians regaining their stolen territory and the democracy movement in Russia, the movement that saw a brief moment of life under Boris Yeltsin when he stared down another coup attempt a generation ago. I'd like to see that reasserting itself to push aside a weakened Putin and try again to plant a flag of hope and progress in the middle of Moscow. But I am jaundiced about the prospects. Indeed, if the alternative to Putin is an ultra-nationalist, ultra-militarist like Prigozhin, there's a reasonable chance we haven't seen the worst of Russia yet. One of the lines I read in the Twitter account of the mutiny cited Henry Kissinger on the Iraq-Iran war. Namely, it's a shame both Putin and Prigozhin can't both lose. That's the only outcome that would really be advantageous to our interests. It will be a while before the dust settles and we know what really happened during the mutiny. It may be even longer before we know its full implications for leadership in Russia and the direction of Russian strategy on everything from the Ukraine war, the confrontation with the West that's at the heart of Putin's strategy, and the alliance without limits that Putin and his Chinese counterpart announced earlier this year. One thing we do know is that we had a ringside seat to a sobering event for our political leaders, including the nearly dozen competing to be Republican candidate for president. We can't have leaders, Republicans or Democrats, who don't take seriously the risk of instability within nuclear-armed Russia and the implications of a fight between crazy extreme nationalists and even crazier, more extreme nationalists, which is precisely what characterizes Putin versus Prigozhin. Our politics may not always be serious, but this is serious business. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تأثير عدم الاستقرار في روسيا على الحملة الرئاسية الأمريكية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. أراكم الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.